Uh, we are with Adelita Husni-Bey, who is a Italo-Libic artist, which is actually based in London.
New York at the moment.
New York, okay. And well, she's in her practice, she's interested in themes such autonomy, collective memory, anarchic pedagogy, and free school. And well, we would like you to, well, if you want to add something about for a short presentation, or in case we would like you to talk about your relationship that you developed between art and pedagogy and your practice.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can talk about your project Postcards from Desert Island, it would be perfect.
Okay, sure. Okay, start. Yeah, stop me when you want. Okay. So, yeah, lots of different questions. Has anybody seen the film? I have trouble figuring out who I'm talking to. Or should I be talking about what the film contains? Does anyone have an introduction to it, or should I just describe it a little bit?
Yeah, it's okay.
So you've seen it, or do you want me to describe it?
No, we've seen it, but if you want to describe it a little bit, it would be perfect. So,
okay. So the film shows a group of children aged 7 to 10 engaged in building a society in their school hall. The way that I started thinking about this film was to try to think about how children who are taught with different methodologies might grow to have very, very different ways of relating to each other and different ways of understanding competition, cooperation, etc. So initially, that was what pushed me to make the film. In the film itself, the children engage in building this kind of society, and although they engage in sort of cooperative practices, they also, to some degree, include parts of what is normalized society in their discourse, as you would, I think, because obviously schooling doesn't just come from school, it comes from everywhere else around you. And so what happens is the children sort of build this new world, and they discuss questions of hierarchy, they discuss questions of public and private, and their understanding of these spheres is highly complex and very, very different, I think, from other schooling sort of children I've worked with in the past. Yeah, so that's basically what the film is. The way that the workshop was held was to approach a school. So I went to the school called École Vitrouve, which is in Paris. It's in Montreuil. The school was started in the 60s as a school to allow for migrants, recently moved migrants, to better integrate into French society. So the sort of the goal of the school itself is a little bit ideological, maybe not in the best of ways. But the interesting thing is that they allowed for a type of methodology that's very much sort of not based on language necessarily, and not necessarily very much based in our traditional understanding of subjects. So the children were sort of taught to through more laboratory-based education. So, for example, one of the types of classes, let's call them, that they had was to make a medieval dinner for themselves and their parents. So they had to make their own clothes, and then they had to work through mathematics and fractions and portions, etc., proportions, through the cutting of the vegetables. So they made this dinner. So they were also then learning about different kinds of histories, colonial histories or crusade, let's say at the time, histories, through this kind of very haptic understanding of knowledge and pedagogy. So I approached the school that I just described, and I asked them if they would be willing for me to work with the children for a period of 3 weeks, of which 3 days would be shot. And then they said yes. We got the parents' agreement, and then I came in the first day. I remember it was actually quite funny. I came in and I was in the school hall, and the children started coming in, and they were sitting down in the school hall, and I didn't really know who I should be talking to because I only spoke to the board of teachers, and that was it. And then no adult ever showed up on any day except for at the very, very end, where somebody came in and just checked that nobody had like really hurt themselves. Other than that, the children are free to roam. They're free to go around. There's not much supervision. And one of the children came to me and said, "When is this thing starting?" Because there was no kind of authority. There was no adult authority in the space. So that's how we started shooting the film. Yeah, I mean, I guess a more interesting part about that work in particular is where it comes from. So as you guys were saying, I've been interested in anarcho-collectivist education for quite some time. I understand anarcho-collectivist education in a very expanded sense. So to me, it's not just spaces that declare themselves anarcho-collectivist, but it's also types of experiments in schooling that can be connected to the movement because they are anti-statist, or they are pacifist, or they are et cetera, et cetera. So as long as they meet sort of a certain set of criteria, I think that they can function as sort of anarcho-collectivist experiments to some degree. So for example, one school I'm very interested in is the modern school, which was started in 1901 by Francis Ferrari-Guardia, who was then killed by the state in 1909. And the school and his whole ideal of the modern school itself was extremely progressive for the time. So they had mixed gender classes, they had no subjects, and then they would have a cooperative of teachers with no headmaster. They would have no grading. They would basically grade through writing reports as a group or individually, but the reports would not necessarily be something that would be then graded itself. It would be a form of either self-grading or grading the group, the collective, how it was functioning. So it's sort of a process of kind of analysis that isn't moral in a way. It's purely kind of to do with understanding how a particular dynamic functions and where it's going. So it's not a question of good or bad, et cetera, et cetera. Other schools I've been very interested in are the schools started and ended, unfortunately, or that's just the way it goes, in the summer of '64 by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the US for children of color. The schools were called Freedom Schools, and they operated only over a summer, where students from universities would go into states where schooling was highly racially divided, and they would do schooling specifically for African American children who at the time, for example, were not allowed in some schools to learn about the Civil War, for example. And in some states, the spending was cut on African American schools up to $21 per child per year, whereas it was $81 per child per year on white only schools. So there were also budgetary differences that were driven by ideological sort of questions. So these schools were set up as a way to reintroduce parts of the curriculum that were sort of non-existent in Black-only schools, and to basically try to open up the pedagogical discourse so that there would be a sort of awakening or an empowering of an oppressed population at the time. So these are two amongst many hundreds of examples, I think, of really interesting pedagogical methods that I think we should be reintroducing and reusing and re-employing. So I think, to me, the first step is looking at what historical models can offer. And so I think there's plenty. I mean, I can offer another long list of examples. look at how these methodologies can be employed materially effectively, what kind of questions are still relevant and how. And I think that in the long run, the question is also like, what does one want to do? Does one want to try to fight local reform? If so, how? Does one want to open up spaces that already are sort of prefigurative, so they've already embody some of these methodologies? Do you want to do both? I think that all of these things should happen, and they should kind of go in hand somehow. So the more practical struggle, and then the actual production of spaces for active learning, that those things should sort of occur in some ways, as much as possible. There is obviously the flip side, which I think is, that because government funding is being cut, there's a tendency to think that these spaces are emerging not so much in response, but potentially to accept the fact that public funding is being cut to the point where these spaces have to emerge, and that they're going to be taken somehow as the de facto new kind of schooling, and that's simply a way of entering the kind of voluntarist trap in some ways. And so these are questions I think that should be on the table too. So if on the one hand there's an attempt to wage war on local reform, then there should also be an attempt to understand what one does by opening these spaces and maybe distracting or detracting attention from a wider national struggle. I spoke for a long time now.
No, but it's super, but well, if you want to go on, you can do it. But I have just a question about your project. Always, again, postcards from the desert island. It was like a setup of a sort of utopia, more or less, isn't it? And how the children deal with with their virgin mentality. I mean, because they were thinking about something completely new for them, how to set up a way of governance, how to deal, how to, I don't know, for example, punish who makes mistake, or how to deal with, how to manage the resources, and with their, I would say, virgin mentality, how they, with their knowledge also, how do they deal with all this concept?
Yeah, so I think that the idea that children are somehow innocent is very misguided. Children are not innocent or unknowledgeable necessarily. They have less experience, of course, than people who are older, but they're also super ideologically imprinted from a very, very early age. So I think the ways in which the children I was working with were acting were essentially not actions based on not knowing or not having the experience, but being ideologically sort of propense to one thing rather than something else. And that happens, I think, as soon as you understand language. There's a threshold where you become a subject in some ways, and you can become an empowered subject, or you can become a subject, a normalized, sort of more oppressed subject, maybe. But the way that they dealt with these questions specifically was, I think, the way that they were, on the one hand, taught to deal with it by their parents or society, and on the other hand, by the way they were sort of experiencing it through this particular type of schooling system. So I guess it was a mixture of both these things. And I don't necessarily think that children can't make very complex decisions. I think the thing that I took away from that workshop was that I was talking to 7-year-olds about public and private space, something that sometimes you can't really talk to your parents about. So I think that that level of complexity is what we should be striving for. And it's not it's not a question of complexity. It's more of a question of what you're being taught, and what you're being taught you can reach, and what kind of decisions you're being taught you can make or think about. And those things, I think, in that particular school were, pushed from a very early age. Whether the complexity of the thought of the children was, let's say, purely a question of parroting something they had already seen or already absorbed, or whether it was, a whole new kind of utopian undertaking. It's very hard to tell where the threshold is. I think that, to me, what was stupefying was the fact that they were very capable, articulated, and had at least an understanding of these questions, that to me made them basically have more stakes in these questions from a very early age, which I think should be the case in other spaces. I hope that answers it.
No, okay, perfect. And I don't know if you want to add something else, or well, no, we are developing this project according to different experiences of autonomous pedagogy, autonomous experiences of pedagogy, and because we want to try to understand in which way we can go change or go against the contemporary concept of education, which is something which is treated as a commodity to be bought or consumed by the capitalistic world. And we would like to understand also I don't know if it's a generic question, but what exactly in how we can deal with the concept of with this problem. I mean, nowadays the students are not anymore able to confront with the society they are living in. They are not responsible. They don't have any kind of responsibility against towards the reality they are living in. And, but instead, the schooling and education should be fundamental instruments for social emancipation. What do you think about the nowadays stage or condition of the academies and of the school?
I mean, very wide question. I think it depends on the country. There's different reforms in different countries. I mean, there's, of course, I think, a very clear ideological shift in Europe. I mean, I'm sure you've talked about it many times. We've just talked about it, but the notion, of course, that you're no more a student, you're a client, your teacher is your sort of, at the same time, your boss and your worker, in a weird way. So I think that in some ways, there's a lot to do in terms of local reform. So one should study what the local reform in Italy, for example, as you know, there's stuff happening at the moment. Figure out strategies to try to actively campaign against what's happening in the current reform. And I think that ways to deal with that are a very widespread sentiment that, yes, education should not be commercialized. It should not be a commodity. I think that the good thing is that there's still a lot of support for this idea that education should not be bought and sold in this way. So I think in that sense, then networking and producing political pressure for specific country reform is extremely important and should be done. On the other hand, actively, as I was saying earlier, one should really think about how to produce living knowledge in a way that is viable, sustainable, that isn't just a one-off project, but that can keep going. That is located in a way and accessible to different groups, and understand really what the pedagogical project is. Because, for example, if you look at Francis Ferrar's schools in the modern school, they acted as day schools for children. And then in the nighttime, they acted as schools for adults, where you would learn very practical DIY stuff. So like dressmaking, how to build your own house, whatever else. And then you would also learn extremely complex philosophy. And this was taught to workers. So I think in Italy, we have a long tradition of the kind of, at least back in the day, of the more intellectual worker coalition in some ways. And I think that that's a very interesting way to reapproach that model through maybe opening centers or thinking about, for example, how squatted centers have operated in Italy and still operate. and how to make sure these spaces remain alive, and how to expand those notions. But I think that very practical tools are as important as theoretical knowledge in the current societies. So there's very interesting sort of groups forming around, for example, how to build your own sort of technologies, peer-to-peer technologies, how to build your own hardware, how to, all of these things we should kind of be back in our hands somehow. So it's both a question of being able to open up the theory to audiences that are interested and that can sort of render their maybe thought processes more complex, but at the same time, how to do the things that we need to do in order to maintain autonomy. Yeah, so that might be effectively learning both, you know, legal frameworks, learning about how to build or make things that we need to make, et cetera, et cetera. So it might be more or less based on these questions, I think.
Okay, perfect. And we would like to finish with the last question.
Yeah.
And in which way you, as an artist, well, which is your approach, your relationship with the institutional world? Well, I mean, where do we have to position our practices, our realities? In as outsider, we have to try to go inside to work with institutions, or do we have to stay outside in a border position? Because, you know, we are talking about different visions of academy, of pedagogical experiences, but how do we have to relate with the institutionalized experiences?
I think that the purist approach is a little bit disempowering. So the kind of I'm either here or here is very it's disempowering. It can become a little bit authoritarian somehow. I think there are ways to slip in and out of networks and steal money, which is what everybody should be doing now. Steal money from institutions, from foundations, just to do your own stuff. So I think there's a huge pots of money now for social projects, socially engaged art. I don't know what it means. Apply for these things, get that money and get these things started, and take it. It's there. If you can have access to it, use it. Money is never clean. You'll never, you know, be in a space where you can just, you know, reproduce yourself out of thin air. You're gonna have to figure out networks of labor that are viable for your situation. But I think that, again, it's like a very like particular approach depending on where you are. And I think, of course, there are maybe, let's call them ethical boundaries that one shouldn't go beyond. But to me, the most important thing is that when you're working, you're, whatever it is you're doing, you're taking into consideration a number of issues that are important, I think, on the left in general. So wage labor, the manners in which you form your cooperative, manners, you know, decisions around visibility and the press. I don't know, there's lots of questions that I think are more important than where you get your money from, or, you know, like whether you should be in or out, because the in and out is a false divide. You're always a little bit in and a little bit out. And you can, I think you have to make sure you're retaining your autonomy and put your foot down when you feel your autonomy is being stepped on somehow. But I think that you can gauge that and you can pull, come in, come out, depending on, yeah, depending on your arrangements, and the arrangements are particular.
Yes. Perfect. We don't want to steal you any more time, and thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you for your time. And nothing.
Okay. Hope it works out.
What?
Hope it works out.
Yeah, yeah, we hope to. Yeah, it's the first hour, and we have other 59 hours. So no, we, yeah, yeah, exactly. No, thank you again, and let's keep in touch.
Yes, for sure. Okay.
Bye. Have a nice day. Bye, ciao, Adelita.
Ciao. Bye.